Hello and welcome to the Extreme Perspectives podcast. This is our first episode. We're thrilled to bring you these conversations with creative outliers, misfits, rebels and crazy ones from the Sense Network. I'm your host, Jeremy Brown. My life has been spent seeking out extreme perspectives to inspire creativity and help some of the world's most innovative companies to be more innovative. This month, we're talking to the outlier and Zen creative Rachel Liu. Keep listening as we discuss the future of leadership and how it's creating open spaces and open dialogue, the collective intelligence of the Chinese healthcare system and how to create better ideas using cross-cultural intelligence, how to find your voice, build creative confidence and shift your mindset from feeling vulnerable to validated. And finally, we talk to Rachel about her passion to create a community of inclusive pioneers. Hey Rachel.
Hey Jeremy.
How you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks.
Thanks for making time for the conversation today. I want to start off with some really fast questions. Who, what, where, who you are, where you're from, what you do.
Okay, so I'm Rachel Liu. I was born in the Cotswolds. I'm currently living in London, and I guess my professional life, I do service design, but I'm a creative at heart.
Excellent. Now, here's the big question of the day. You have to choose one of these. Are you an outlier, a misfit, a rebel, or a crazy one?
I would say outlier.
Excellent. Great. I know a little bit about your thoughts around cultural intelligence, but I'd love to know the journey that you've been on through your life and sort of what has led you to be thinking about and acting on this today.
I guess part of the lockdown has been a definite trigger, more because it really look at what really matters. And I think part of the movement of the Black Lives Matter, where can my role sit and be within that space? And I'm always one person that really, I guess, driven by passion. And I like to make more impact with the work that I do. And it just happens that over the years, kind of fighting, I would say, before between the Western and Eastern world, I never knew, I think until a few years ago when I was learning about leadership, which is actually all about understanding who you are. So it's uncovering those really vulnerable parts. But actually, it's integrating where both can coexist. So I don't actually need to fight it. It's just kind of a different way of thinking, a different approach. And actually, it makes everything much more richer. I have a understanding as an outlier between those two worlds. You know, I might not fit into one or the other. But actually, through the research that I do, get into more strategic work, those insights are real nuggets for today's businesses, whether it's improving or coming up with a new idea and service, or if it's actually about cultivating a good culture. And that's where that inclusion becomes a big part. Like, how do you really design to make things inclusive? People talk about that over the years, but what does that really mean? And I guess for me, feeling excluded in certain experiences has helped me to figure out actually what are the kind of core ingredients for that. And just talking to people openly about it, like quite open terms. What was really interesting was that actually everyone wanted to talk about it. There's just no medium or channel or way to talk about it because it's not a pleasant, it's not comfortable topic to talk about in moments when you're feeling kind of excluded per se. But actually when you have that experience and the feeling, that what makes design much more powerful in a way. So how do you kind of get people to feel included at every touch point or every step? And that could be in work and life.
So what experiences have you had to inform this thinking?
I guess experiencing culture shock going abroad has really changed the way I think about things. So as a British-born Chinese, BBC, some people call it, I guess I always thought I had traditional values, I always thought that I'd tried to integrate both of them, or I'm quite, there are some Eastern elements there. But it's only when going abroad to somewhere like China, I didn't speak the language. I didn't realize how westernized my thinking was. That's that kind of weird acronym. So westernized, that I'm actually quite educated within the whole education system, and I was working in the education space. So I understood the competitiveness there was, because if you don't get to a certain level in China, you're left out, you're left behind. There's no more opportunities. So it's so fierce compared to, say, in the UK. So that was quite interesting. It was almost undoing and questioning all the things I thought I knew, and assumptions that I have made or beliefs that I have made, and to really understand why. So certain things really frustrated me when I was in China. So an example was when I went to the GP to see a doctor, and my friend was the translator for me. So that was really nice of her. But I was just like, why are the people in the room with me? Why is there no privacy? Why is there, this is not right and everything. But they're normal, because they're much more that kind of community collective kind of thing where they all share knowledge by default. So that was an opportunity for them to kind of learn more tips and stuff, so they don't always have to make trips to the doctors. But I would never have thought of it that way, because I was really defensive. I was like, why are they watching me, and why are they listening in? Like, where's the personal boundaries and things?
So you're saying the reason it was open is so other people can listen in and learn. So it's sort of improving their collective intelligence, sort of.
Yeah, because it's quite communal, quite collective kind of thing by default. And that's one of the biggest, I guess, difference between the Western and Eastern. There is this kind of collectivism in general. So an example was with the face mask since the lockdown, right? I was very kind of conscientious and observant of, okay, when do I wear a face mask? But abroad, face masks were the first thing that sold out, and they were questioning why loo roll is not, why it's in such demand in UK. My friends just didn't understand it, because everyone by default would wear the face mask. It's like, I don't want to spread, anything. It's more to protect everyone around you. It's a respect almost. But in UK, it's never been a norm. It's a new thing. It kind of means that you are infected almost. I don't know, there's that negative connotation to face masks. So it's very different. And in Japan, I remember going there for like near Halloween. Everyone was wearing black face masks, and it was a cool thing. It was very trendy to wear it as a default. So you can see that the cultural norms really, kind of means that the interpretation and the why they do things the way they do, that's what we really need to understand. Otherwise, there's just misunderstanding, and then there's just lots of conflicts.
So do you think there are specific people who need to understand, or do you think this is important for sort of everyone on planet Earth to have a better appreciation of what you're working on?
I think everyone isn't aware of their own privileged blind spots. And I think until you are working in those spaces, you might not ever be aware. You don't know the own bubbles that you are living in. So for example, like the London bubble is one example, like that the amount of work that we do and think, well, if it's in London, the rest of the UK will be like that as well. That solution would work. But because it seems so distant and so far, we almost don't, it's kind of quite abstract. We can't conceptualize it. And that's why what we've done with research is really bringing the stakeholders in a journey with us, being there in the process itself, so they can hear from, say, different learners of how they think about things, because their mental model might be quite different. And that means that, like it changes like the way that we design things. Like maybe we need it more modular, so you get actually inspiration for somewhere like Japan, where if you see their compartments and everything, it's very small space, right? So they might be using one space for their bedroom, for the dining, to eat and everything. But because everything's designed so modularly and you can pack it away, could we not use that inspiration to then, think about designing small spaces within the UK, for example? So actually, I don't think there's enough that cross-pollination of ideas, because we always, I guess, the conditioning think that the Western is the best way. And the Eastern have been looking at it that way too. Like, we want to be in America. If you translate the word America in Chinese characters, it's like beautiful, beautiful country. But actually, some of the things that are maybe slightly more Eastern ideas, there could be inspiration there too. Some of the things that COVID has really surfaced up is really like, what really matters? It's back down to basic needs. And it's for us to really take a pause, actually. But you can see that some people worked even faster or quicker, because that's more of their survival way of, doing things.
So what have you observed over the lockdown period? Are there any observations that you've made that are particularly pertinent to this?
I think what's interesting is the human interaction, right? Because everyone's on screens and things. So I've heard mixed things about, some have been thriving. So they feel that they can maybe have their voice heard because it's a different medium, which is super interesting, because maybe some which are maybe the quieter voice and things, there are maybe the chat and stuff like that, where they can almost be a bit more reflective and then add their input. But I would have to say it has to be designed for, because you can put people all in one room and go, let's work together. But if you're not really aware of how do you set that dynamics to make it a really safe space for people to share, you're not really going to have a meaningful conversation or get the output that you want from it. So I think what was been interesting, I've seen like there's quite a lot of like the co-creation style, where they create the space using the visual, using a combination of tools, using the breakouts in Zoom, where you can have the smaller intimate conversations, as well as a slight bigger one, but giving people time as well, because not everyone is good at thinking aloud or being the loudest. It's kind of making sure that everyone's voices is heard. So it does make me question, like, oh, okay, what other ways can we facilitate those conversations in a more meaningful way? And I guess that's because, for me, one crucial part is like building trust online is different. And that's just more of a curiosity that's got me to look at how might this work.
So how are you bringing this all together, all these observations? Because it sounds like really valuable learnings you're putting together. How are you using that? Can you sort of share some of those ideas and sort of what you're pulling together?
So one part is doing, having done talks has helped me to kind of consolidate, well, what are the sort of, it's almost like a framework, first of all, look at what your privileged blind spots are, kind of with the weird acronym, is it westernized, are you educated, is it industrialized, so forth. Really question those things. Secondly is really looking at, it's actually all about you first. It's the awareness piece, because then it's your circles. How culturally diverse is that? What does that look like within that space, your space first? And then it's looking at, well, here, based on research and insights, there are certain cultural traps.
For example, what might a trap be?
For a service design point of view, like channels or access. So we assume that because Google, kind of Facebook are so widely used and everything, we assume that every country, because, it's the biggest, it's most known in UK and in Canada and US and so forth, is used the same way. But what we realized, so somewhere like Philippines, I didn't know this until I went out there, they use Facebook much more heavily. I think for us, we've been declining our use in Facebook. But for them, because when you buy a data SIM, it's unlimited Facebook time. Of course, they're going to use it a lot. And I didn't know the reason until I talked to one of the education agents, and she told me why. So just little nuggets like that. And then you contrast with China, where Google is banned. I think everyone forgets that Google's banned, Instagram is banned. Even like they have their own kind of WeChat, which is everything's integrated. It's so seamless. They have everything in one app. They've made it a whole ecosystem. Whatever you pay, everything is through that app. And it's interesting how fast they grew from something that was very cash focused in the past whilst I was living in China. But 5 years onwards, they're pretty much cashless. Like every time I visited China, it changed. And I think that was what's interesting. It's like you have to the research you do doesn't always last that long either. So it has to be just enough research that it's iterative. But there are certain patterns that you can kind of see just to at least question. Then, okay, you might generate ideas, but it's all about how might you nudge those behaviors that you want them to kind of have. And there's a model which is it's based on the behavioral design BJ Fogg model. And it's all about your ability. So there's like maybe constraints like access or money or other things, time and things. And then there is one, can't quite remember the top of my head right now, motivation. So it's something that you can't really force, or there needs to be a certain level of motivation to do it. If it's not easy to do, just like building habits. And I think about this because we're in that learning space. So a lot of the things that we design is getting them to learn, getting them to grow to the next kind of stage. How do we help them through that transition? If it wants to feel like a guided, is it more of a coach? Does it need to be much more hands-on? Does that need to be that personal element? Or could we use something like AI and stuff? How can we make that language, again, that human aspect that we kind of tend to not embed enough within sometimes of the products? We think too much on the technology side. So it's bringing that into the surface, really.
So when you give your talks, what types of people come along to that, and what do they get out of it? What attracts them? So
a lot of the talks at the moment, I guess, is similar to my community of researchers, user experience designers, strategists, anyone working in digital, other service designers, so within that space. I think for them is to look at things with different lenses that we might not usually question, and it helps them just inform their work and do that kind of almost make the impact that they want to make. I think designers always want to make positive change. So it's almost to give them a framework to help them to do that based on real life case studies as well. So sometimes it's more case study examples that I've done, like how do you build a service which is for English language learning for anyone who wants to study and migrate abroad. Let's unpick that. Let's look at the frameworks and things that I have used. Let's look at the journey mapping that I have done, and how do we compare with one market to another. So it's really kind of almost sharing that knowledge so that the conversation can grow. And what happens is that usually people might come to me, or they might want to have the conversation deeper, or they might want to be mentored or coached. And this is why recently I thought that actually launching something as a side project, kind of Inclusive Pioneers, is just a way of growing that conversation more of a broader audience. Because I don't think this has to be just within the design space, actually.
No, I agree. I think creativity is one of those things that makes us uniquely human, and it applies to all of us, not just people who choose to do it as their day job. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You talk about cultural intelligence and we talk about creative intelligence, but there's clearly a lot of crossover in sort of what we observe and why we think it's so valuable. So what's the next step
So at the moment, I'm getting people to see if they're interested, whether it's workshops that they would want, or whether they want to kind of help to co-create what that community might be like. It's still very early on. And it's, at the moment, I've had a few conversations, and it's super interesting how do you get people to have a voice?
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about finding voice. Is that something you've experienced personally?
Yeah, so I guess my calling for the Inclusive Pioneers side project was that saying that invisible voices do matter. So that was the blog that I wrote. And it's to really gather my thoughts on that, because a lot of the time we shy away, or there's the confidence thing, or we are not enough. And that is so common. I think it's more like, well, actually, how can we help people then to help them have that confidence, to help them find, their voice, not other people's voices. So it was really interesting, because I guess my journey, when I started, I'm like, oh, I need to have role models, but I want to become that person or that person there. And I remember one of my mentors was like, no, it's actually really figuring out more of who you are. And I'm like, no, but I don't want to know about that part. I want to know, how to get there. So we're kind of this like, oh, what's the next biggest goal? And we're always thinking of the achievement part. But what's more powerful, and me and my mentor, we did a joint presentation this year, talk, and it was about growing leadership through mentorship. So I've been with him for 3 years, and he's been coaching me. And he got me out of my comfort zone. He got me to talk about the stories that were really vulnerable, where I think I was not good enough to say, do a talk, public speaking. And this was because, I think it was because it was more prestigious. I was like, oh, it's strategy. Look, there's lots of top leaders. They are director level, et cetera, et cetera. How can I be good enough to do it? And he's like, I've seen you talk. You can apply for it. And I just kind of coach you on what sort of questions you need to answer. And I remember getting in, and then I was like, no way, I actually got an opportunity to talk. And I'm like, shit, I actually have to figure out what the talk is now. The hard work actually begins there. And it's interesting, even when I delivered the talk, and this was a story that I did talk about, I thought I failed. I thought I did really badly. I was like, oh my God, now over 200 people saw me live, did the talk, couldn't answer the questions. I wanted to just hide away. And actually people were coming up to me and going, oh, can I find out more? So, this and this and that. So I was like, oh, okay, that wasn't what I expected. So it's really, kind of really to think about, how do I kind of have that confidence to know that I am okay and good enough, or I can continuously keep learning, even if I make mistakes, it's okay.
So we observe this. There's a vulnerability before you share things.
Yes.
And then once you've shared it, you can start to feel validated, because it's become real and you've put it out there. But you were saying people coming up to you afterwards, what sort of things were they saying?
They just were really curious. I think it's to continue the conversation. But I think because it's talking through the emotion part and the storytelling part, and I present it that way because I find that's the easiest way for me to do it. And it's a bit of me where I add that passion. That passion is that confidence, actually, is that courage. And that's what then makes it really interesting, because sometimes when you approach a person for the first time and you don't really know who they are, but there's no common thread of what that conversation is, it becomes very generic. So what do you do? But what do you do isn't really like telling you the whole person.
Yeah.
That's just one aspect of it. And I think we tend, and that's why I don't usually enjoy networking events at all. They're not that kind of intimate, meaningful like conversations that you get. And interesting, what happens with the talks is that every time afterwards, people follow up because they want to understand more, or how they can learn more about it, or how they might apply it. It sparks that curiosity.
Yes. That's a very important word, isn't it? So what sort of people are following up, and what sort of feedback are you getting from them?
So it's been interesting that the people who are more that outlier like me, they might have lived in two different, say, cultures, or, you know, kind of have that mixed kind of identity where they might feel that they fit to conform to something, but they feel that that's like but all their lives they've been trying to figure out a way to belong in one or the other and things like that in these boxes. And it's actually like going, no, but not having these boxes are okay. So it's interesting that that's the people that I've been almost attracting. And it was super interesting that people who are Asian that I've also attracted to. And I did wonder, I was like, why is it that the fact that I attract more, I guess, the Asians more in some sense? Or when I was a mentor, there was loads of mentees that were of an Asian kind of culture. And actually, a lot of it comes down to that psychological safety. You know, we need to feel safe. We need to feel understood. And there's a bigger, more chance to, because you are more relatable and you might have gone through an experience, which is interesting. And not saying that that's right or wrong, but it's interesting that that's the kind of people that kind of are coming to me.
So this might be a tricky question to ask, but I'll give it a shot anyway. How do you design for that? So you're a designer. You've got this insight around building trust. How might you go about designing for something like that? What have you observed?
So in terms of research, building that rapport and spending more time on that preparation, getting to know a bit about who they are, makes a huge difference. So I haven't had a problem, say, even with different cultures, Dubai, India, Turkey, and so forth. I haven't really had a hurdle to kind of come across, but I think it's more just being really friendly and non-judgmental from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think it's those principles. It's like, how do you make it that it's not judgmental, it's very open, and it's those little qualities, like what are the small things that you can do that can make them feel a bit more heard or a bit more safe. And sometimes it is just checking in on them. And it's the same with my colleagues, like, you know, now we're kind of in a team that's kind of working more remotely. That's very unusual for us. And a lot of times where we go into a meeting and jump into a meeting, we're like, right, what's the agenda today? You know, let's get on it. But we forget about that human aspect of it, where normally if you were to see that person face to face, there are a few couple of small things that you know it's quite normal to do. And I think it's just remembering those things. Like, how would you want to be invited if you were the other person as well?
I was going to ask, because you joined us recently for one of our meetups.
Yes.
And I wondered what you made of that, because that is essentially a bunch of complete strangers meeting online at a given time,
yeah,
with no agenda.
I think it's I like the icebreaker is super important, and the icebreaker has to be quite open, and that gets you into that curiosity mindset really early on. So I think Rashita got us to think about, you know, like a word of something. I can't remember the exact thing, but I think thinking about it in that way, there's a bit of novel to it, and there's a bit of that playfulness. So I always think of, like, if you're going to make something inclusive, make it inclusive for a child to be invited, that they want to play, because that usually is quite universal. And it's interesting that sometimes strangers, you can get rid of those barriers more sometimes, you know.
Yeah.
Which I find that's quite interesting. Not sure the reason why or your thoughts on that, but sometimes it's easier.
Yes, we were listening to a completely bonkers lecture by a quantum physicist the other day, who was talking about the future of humanity. And one of the things that, one of the examples he gave was, I think I'm correct in saying this, it was with when there is within the Native American culture, when there was an issue, the 30 or 40 people who could influence that issue all got together and sat in a circle, but they didn't actually talk about the issue. They just talked to each other, just through talking about, I don't know, I guess the weather, or, just that stuff. That's, I think that's, and this is where I was just trying to join some dots with what you were saying. What I took away from hearing that was actually a lot of those problems take care of themselves just when you start to level with people and you just open up as a normal human being. And, when you say sometimes it's easier with strangers, yeah, because you don't know anything. You have to be a little bit curious. You have to strike up a conversation. You have to go searching for maybe some common ground, or you might have to lean in and get interested in something that you know nothing about. And so suddenly that puts you in a very vulnerable space, and, they can educate you and they kind of give you something. And that's where, those bonds and that trust come from. And sometimes, when I thought about that example, I was thinking, that could actually be the answer. You don't necessarily need to have a big, clever agenda. The smart thing to do might just get a bunch of people together and just get talking.
Yeah, I do wonder with people with authority, though, how might you do that? So I think it might be harder knowing that person is of authority. You kind of act in a different way. So one pattern, another cultural pattern I see between the kind of more Eastern mindset is this whole hierarchy. So it's almost like, oh, but then my opinions won't count, I won't express what I really feel, and can't do that. I have to respect more of the elders. They know better, etc., etc. So I wonder in those kind of environments, how might you just break away from that?
Do you sometimes when you think about those leaders, what do you think is going on for them? How do you think they feel if they're meeting someone who may not feel that they measure up or shouldn't even be having a conversation with them?
How do you think the leaders feel?
Yeah. So you were thinking about it from the perspective of someone talking to a leader. I was thinking, a lot of what you've talked about is about building empathy. I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts on, what might be going on for that leadership team when they see stuff going on, or there's things that they might be completely dislocated from. They may not have that same level of awareness that you have.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I guess it depends on that kind of how they define leadership, right?
Yeah.
Because my perception of leadership might be quite different. There is this whole redefining what leadership really means today. And I might have a different take on it than, say, maybe other generations or other cultures and things.
So what's your view on leadership?
So I feel like leadership is one where you can actually lead and drive change influence change from there. I do kind of believe that the more inclusive ones are the ones that wants everyone to be heard, wants things, kind of quite done collectively. But I have also experienced, being in China, and I've seen very different types of leadership out there. Some I definitely don't resonate with, which is why I brought up the question, sometimes if people are in that position, and I've been fortunate that I haven't really been in that, and I can actually question and be curious in that, even if sometimes there is a level of fear. And I think there always is. It's actually, even with that level of fear, what can you do to add a little bit more courage, and build on that? Because I think leading with that kind of influence, you become that role model for others too.
So what practical things could a leader do? Or what would you observe? What sort of practical things would they be doing to be more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you mentioned empathy, and I think that word is used a lot, so I don't want to I do think that kind of cultural intelligence element. So we're living in a world that's very uncertain, kind of things are complex. Actually, they are completely okay of not knowing the answer. and they are okay to bring other people in the room, you know, and be challenged. And I think it's that openness to it, that mind shift that like, actually we are all probably relearning, unlearning and learning together. And that is part of the process. So I think having that mindset from right at the beginning is super important. So building that trust, how do you make it that kind of safe playground for everyone to be involved?
Building trust, what activities are you undertaking in order to do that?
I think getting to know who they are, the other person. Mm-hmm. Because if you know who they are, what they're motivated by, and actually what their skills and what their passions are, I think it goes a long way. Someone was telling me the other day, you can't really like motivate someone to do stuff, really. Not to that degree, you can't really influence, but you can influence their, like, build on their ability, regardless of what constraints that they have. I think that's super important.
Slightly different question now. As a part of your work, you've got your, I think you talk about your perspective lens, and you've got experts, business and users. And then under users, you talk about extreme users. Yeah. What extreme users have you encountered, and how has that been useful to you?
So a lot of the times so I take the extremes as in people we always don't believe we can design for. The ones that we feel get in the way of decision making, that are inconvenient, that are hard to reach, that are maybe the ones that have a quieter voice, you know, that especially since an example would be, there's one part of the business at Pearson where it's B2B, and we get a lot of the kind of the people who are decision makers are the ones who are at the schools, right? But we build the products for the kids. We don't generally get to the kids very easily because maybe they're harder to reach, you know, they might not be able to express themselves through words. But actually, when we're designing something, again, we need that emotion side. Where's the human element part of how they view the world through progress and things? And we decided to be more playful and have the kind of co-creative things where they did arts and crafts almost. And it was a really simple example where it was building a progress report over time. What does those achievements look like? What sort of things do they even like collecting? You know, and we got them to do a video of who they are, get them to show us their favorite toys. What do they kind of, the collections of things, whether it's stamps, whether it's games or whatever it is. And we did it for different age groups because I think there was the whole idea that, oh, we need to design one, report thing for all the age groups. And we're like, I don't think that's the case, sort of thing. So we kind of make sure like, okay, well, let's try this out. And it was super interesting. So say like a 5-year-old, they view the world through characters only. So when you kind of give them more, like what they think of achieving more things, they add more eyes or they will add more mouths. So it was like, oh, right, so that is their world. They can't understand the world of obstacles at the moment or making progress in a different way. Whereas you got the slightly older, then it became more of a game. It's like, oh, okay, well, once upon a time there was this, and then this will happen, and then this drama happens. And they were so imaginative. And it was really interesting for those who are non-English speakers and the English speakers, like English as a second language. Because then we saw when we got them to write a postcard to summarize the story, we can see the difference in terms of what they really understood in like a report time of thing. So it was like, oh, talk about all these jargons with learning objectives, you know, things like that. In their world, they don't understand it in that, and they probably don't care. So I think that gave us like almost reimagined the kind of how we view progress much more broader. And those insights, because they were tangible as well, we can make clips of it. You know, you can make the report almost telling that story of like, look, when they grow older, this is what they expect and things, and show it visually.
With that insight, what did that lead you to design differently? How did you act on that?
Yeah, so we end up actually making different variations. We had the whole character introduction to it. It just made everything much more vibrant, because there's a lot of the times where the kind of the enterprise stuff just seems to be heavy, doesn't it? It seems to be clinical. And it was one of the first ones that we've actually made it much more of that kind of vibrancy and things, that it got spreaded as a whole case study around as well, different departments and actually different countries. So it actually gave us a whole platform to kind of go, oh, we can design for young learners. Young learners could be much more creative in the way that we do things. And it gave us permission to even think about a young learner design system, for example. What does that kind of look like? So we've almost got the kind of, I guess we built the trust by showing value to our stakeholders. Then we can actually kind of uncover more things we would like to explore.
So I'm just going to switch the conversation slightly now. What do you call your project? Have you got a name for this side hustle?
I call it the Inclusive Pioneers. It's the project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so thinking ahead, where ultimately would you like to get that to? What would you like to do with it? What's the end goal? How will you know you've ticked this box and achieved this goal you've set yourself?
I'm not sure if I've set myself a concrete goal. Partly is to raise awareness and just almost build a community, I would say first. I think that's more important, is that human aspect first. Mm-hmm. How I can help and educate, that can come in so many formats. And I think that's the part to explore. So yeah, I would like to, co-create what that community might look like and just get people involved, just to build on each other's stories and things, just to have inspiration ideas initially. And then, like finding more formal ways of like, actually, if this is a key topic like voice, I don't know, or awareness of privileged blind spots and stuff, we can then do workshops or things like that, a bit more interactive. Mm-hmm. But I always find like learning by doing and kind of the experiential way is my preferred method of learning. So I kind of want to bring some of those things to life as well.
So how could the Sense Network potentially help you do that? What could, if you were to say 3 things that we could potentially kind of tell your story to the network, which we're doing now, and if there was an ask, what could be a practical thing that people could do to help?
So they can definitely check out the actual sign up kind of page to see whether, it interests them. There are free options, whether it's 4 options, in fact, whether it's meetup or workshop that they want to attend, or they want to co-create some of their ideas, or they want to share a story. It links to the blog as well, why I started it, which is about the kind of invisible voices matter.
You mentioned Black Lives Matter at the beginning, and you're talking about, what you're thinking about in relation to that.
Yeah, I feel that even I need to learn much more about the whole Black Lives Matter and educate myself. So I know that for a fact that I have my own kind of blind spots, but there are certain similarities in terms of getting people's voices heard in a way. It was really interesting hearing some stories of representatives, even those within our work. It was so much more courage for them to share their story. So how do we kind of get the scaffolding in place to make sure that they can do that? What should it be, or what is my space within that? So it's like that sense of belonging part is quite a key thing. What does that really mean in this modern day? And just that we don't really talk about it that much. There's no channel for that. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter and what you're doing as well.
Well, there are so many voices and so many stories. And I think that there are so many different drivers as well. And I probably come from, my perspective is about having an open mind on everything. So, it's in terms of listening, understanding, that's just by our very nature what we do as a business. I don't think we could have been successful doing what we've done for many years all over the world with different cultures if we didn't have that. So for us, there's a little bit of decoding to kind of say, all right, we all feel pretty comfortable with, difference. And, one of the things that we're always trying to do is kind of understand those similarities and differences and kind of pinpoint the stuff and what can we actually do to remedy situation. What's that intervention that you can make?
It's hard because it's a systemic issue, isn't it? So it's like, what could we be doing within what we know? We can't solve all of this on our own, but what could we be contributing to?
And actually doing it in a thoughtful way, not just jumping on the sort of jumping in and saying, well, we'll do this and we'll do that. It's like, no, how can you make a real difference? It goes way, in terms of the inclusivity that we think about, it has to be, could anybody engage with this, irrespective of where they live in the world? I mean, yes, we might have a language barrier. There's a language issue that we know that we can't deal with right now. But in terms of accessibility, in terms of taking part, we actually, as a business, that's exactly what we do. We thrive on difference. We view it as a really valuable, to have those different voices in the process is hugely valuable. In fact, I'm writing an ebook at the moment on cognitive diversity, but the definition of, let me just find it, there it is. So when we talk about cognitive, it's the difference in perspective or information processing styles. That's, I think, what was really attractive about what you're doing, because there's so much similarity and crossover. It was about genuinely being inclusiveness, because only once you've got proper diversity can you actually strike equilibrium. And that's kind of was my point about sharing that story about just sitting around in a circle and talking. We don't necessarily, it's just about having that level of integration and people coming together and just, meeting on an equal footing. And for me, it's about unity and bringing people together. So with, specifically, why we value the cognitive diversity, and this does give everyone an equal voice, is because it's just how different individuals think about and engage with new, uncertain or complex situations. So when you ask me about Black Lives Matter, I've had to do a huge amount of reading on that. And there's so much going on. I haven't really been able to unpick it. It's much more complex than
definitely
a hashtag right now. So I don't have a straightforward answer. All I can say is, it's led me in the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's led me to so much new stuff and read so much stuff. That didn't really answer your question. But
I think it's the current thinking, and I think it just shows the level of complexity of anything. There are so many ways to read up or look at things, but really connecting the dots on where do you stand in that? Where would you want to be in that? Because you're right, there are, I guess, it's easy to use the hashtag.
Yeah.
But what does that really mean longer term, I think would be more interesting, right? What does that mean in putting it into action later on? Yeah. I think that's where you really know which companies, organizations and institutions that really, kind of care about that union sort of space.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we'd better wrap up. But thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, no, likewise, for inviting me.
That brings us to the end of this great conversation with Rachel. It was good to discover her ideas around cultural intelligence and how extreme users and hard-to-reach people can help us to design more vibrant and meaningful products and services. We'll be back soon with another mind-expanding conversation. Thank you for tuning in to the Sense Network. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did like it, we'd love to hear what you think. So please leave us a comment and share it with your friends. In the meantime, you can find us on Instagram, that's at The Sense Network. And if you want to get hands-on with an innovation project to make things better and make better things for people and the planet, join the Sense Network, linked in the description. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.